these great people who believe in equality. How do you believe in equality? You know, the greatest problem in this country was, how do you believe in equality of man and yet enslave a group of men? How do you believe in this and mistreat and discriminate? In order to get out of that dilemma, then, you must make those people what? Less than men, less than human. You see? So then in that way you can justify what you're doing. They're not fully human. They're not fully men. They're not fully intelligent. They're not fully capable of self-government. They're not fully capable of guiding themselves. Therefore, it's only incumbent on us, those of us who are lucky enough to be more intelligent and divinely sent to rule over men, to take care of them. It is incumbent upon us to take up what? The white man's burden, which happens to be the black man. But actually the other way around is we have to carry them as a burden. The maladjustment of black people maintains Eurocentric self-esteem, self-definition and identity, self-concept, sense of security, wealth and power, and control. Since the captive African's debilitated state, debased and degraded nature will not permit him to successfully overcome such dominance. The lowest European on the lowest street, Skid Row in this country, can always say one thing: at least I'm not black. He defines himself, and his self-esteem still rests upon the ultimate degradation of black people. So no matter how low and evil he sinks, he still has a superiority attitude toward black people. And therefore the degradation of black people and maintaining black people in that state is important to the European sense of self-esteem and self-identity. The European more or less defines himself in contrast to the African person. Many of you have run into Europeans, and when you came to be what they did not expect to be, you've seen them unravel before your very eyes. When they could not play their accustomed role of dominance and mastery, you've seen them become unglued and unable to function, to become confused. It means then that our submission and subordination and degradation keeps them together. And therefore it is necessary for them to maintain this degraded state in black people in order to maintain their sense of self as a people. And by maintaining us in this debased state and degraded state, they therefore maintain their security, because as long as we think neurotically and maladjustedly, then we will not be able to think in a way that will ultimately defeat them as a people and ultimately destroy them as a people. And remember, we're talking about people who are a minority in the world, and yet who must protect their interest. Black maladjustment induces the captive African to engage in self-defeating behavior, which relieves the Eurocentric establishment of having to impose direct militaristic oppression and to blame the victim for his own predicament. We get plenty of that, of course. In other words, when you get the black maladjusted to a certain degree, he will defeat himself. Well, look, I put libraries in your community, you just don't like to read. We have schools here, you just like to drop out for some reason. The knowledge is available to you, you just don't like it for some reason or other. It's a very slick system because it permits then the European to pretend that they are liberal and open and so forth, and yet at the same time maintain themselves. And of course, I often talk about this, the European talks about freedom of speech. But we are only free to speak when our audience does not hear us. We are only free to speak when our audience is not interested. We are only free to speak when the audience really does not listen. Oh, I can sit here and call Reagan all kind of names and talk about white folk. That illustrates what a great system we have here. But how is this possible? To a good extent it's possible because, you see, at first you induce the audience not to be what? Interested, not to care or to be apathetic, and then you just let the person speak as long as they want to. You induce the audience not to be active, and therefore knowing that after the speech is over, no real activity will take place, so you let them talk as much as they want to. So the system of slavery, you see, and Jim Crowism that occurred shortly thereafter structured the black personality in such a way that despite the Marcus Garveys and the Malcolm X's and other people, there's been relative little change, because the reception often of the audiences was such that they would not threaten the United States after they heard the speech. We are only free in this country to do the wrong thing. Recognize what happened to Farrakhan. Farrakhan has been saying the same thing for 20 years. But to a good extent, when the whites actually thought that black people might really be listening to Farrakhan, might really act upon what Farrakhan was saying, he can't now get into Javits Center. Now he's having a hard time finding a place to speak and a platform to speak to black people. Is this the country of free speech, ladies and gentlemen? You better not believe it. There's no way. We say we are free. What is freedom, we say? Freedom to do what we want to do. But stop a minute and think. What makes you want to do what you want to do? And you might come to realize then that our very wants and our very desires have been what? Induced. So that the things we really want and the things we really desire are those things that maintain the system and are those things that destroy us as a people. But yet we object to anyone speaking about it because we see our indulgence in them as some expression of our what? Freedom. Yet in this system, when you so-called let a people free, and yet you must maintain them in subordination, they must then, with their freedom of choice, always choose what? The wrong thing. But you give them a foolish pride into thinking that since they have choice, they are therefore free. A very slick system. It induces the captive African to behave in such a way such that he will economically and otherwise and apparently of his own accord support the European establishment to the detriment of his own without being conscious of his doing so. Why should a black person be made to feel ugly? What is the function of associating blackness and ugliness, blackness and uncleanliness, blackness and unlovableness, of being unlovable? Is it just purely a racist attitude of some evil people? What do you do when you feel ugly or unkempt? But you do something else beside that. You go out and you buy yourself a new, you go out and spend a lot of money. But what's happening here? Who do you spend it with? Who gets the buck of the money that's spent? In other words, the African feeling ugly and unclean in his attempt to compensate for that feeling of ugliness and uncleanliness goes to the very person who made him feel that way in the beginning and purchases and buys from that person, and therefore maintains the very individual to destroy their self-image to start with. Do you think then an economic system that depends upon a bunch of people trying to compensate for feelings of inferiority by buying brand names? I don't know where brands, you know. By buying names of other people on their clothing? Do you think that system is ever really going to let you out of that feeling of ugliness? It can't. It's economically dependent upon that feeling, ladies and gentlemen. If we were made to feel naturally beautiful, don't you know we would destroy the cosmetics and industry?